Let's also have a quick overview of 3D Studio Max's material system. I'm going to cover a lot about the material system as we go, but I just want to give you the basics of this. So you can get to the material system a couple of different ways. Under the rendering menu, you have a menu item for the material editor, but you can also get to it with this little toolbar button here. And you get some menus, some icons surrounding, but you see the two main regions of this thing are these 6 shader balls, or material previews, and then your parameters down here. So if you click on, the next one of these, the parameters of whatever you've clicked on will come up down here. And 3D Studio by default has 6 shader balls here. There's actually some sliders, so you can drag over and over and over and get a few more. You can also right-click, and there's some functionality in the right-click menu if you click over a shader ball. And so if you right-click, you can say 3x2, so 3x2, 5x3, or 6x4. There's 24 total material preview slots. So you notice that the scroll bars aren't working anymore, and if I go back to 3x2, I can scroll around this way as well and get access to more. But if you select 6x4, that's all the material previews you have. Now that doesn't mean that there can only be 24 materials in a scene. You can have as many as you want. It's just that you can only really be actively working or previewing in the materials editor 24 at a time. So right click and go back to 3x2. I usually leave it on 3x2. I like to see nice big balls. So if you have some object in your scene, let's just make something and put it in there. It doesn't matter what it is. And I want to take this material and assign it to that object. I have this button here, Assign. But I can also take it and drag and drop it on an object as well. And 3D Studio is great because as you're dragging and dropping, it'll tell you with a little tooltip there what it's about to drop that material onto. And then when you've assigned a material to something in the scene and that thing is selected, you'll get these little white corners in the shader ball, in the material preview. If I unselect it, you'll see that the corners are still there, but they're kind of grayed out. So it just means that something is assigned, but it's not currently selected. That's selected. Now, down here you have the parameters. Right here you have the name, so you can call it whatever you like. So if we call this something, then we can edit the parameters of this. You can leave them the default names, but it's a good habit to get into naming them correctly. I'm naming them what they are. So you see some basic parameters here. And this, what we're working in right now, is called a standard material, and it says so over here. Right next to the name, this is the material type. If I click this button, it'll come up with this material map browser, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but you can change the material types to various kinds of things. But the standard material in 3D Studio is quite rich, actually. So in the shader basic parameters, you can actually switch the standard shader from several different shading models. There's anisotropic, there's blend, there's metal, multilayer, Ornayer blend, Phong and Strauss, and translucent. So each one of these primarily have different specular qualities or specular components, with the exception of Ornayer. That's a different diffuse model, and one that's good for things like paper or anything at all that has a roughness to it. In order to see the effect of this, you have to turn on a little bit of specularity, which is basically the shininess of the thing. And so you have a level, that's how much, how bright it is, and then a glossiness, which is how sharp the little reflection is in there. And if I change this to these different shading models, you'll see anisotropic. What it does is it takes that specular highlight and lengthens it in one direction. It's not isotropic, it's anisotropic, meaning that it's stretched in one direction versus another. And so you can see here you have a slightly different specular preview, which as you increase anisotropy, the highlight is spread or narrowed in one direction more than the other. And you have a slightly different preview here. This is specular direction in one, or specular size in one direction, and this is in the other direction. So if you switch it back to something more isotropic like Phong or Blinn, you see you just have a little graph. But this graph in either Phong or Blinn represents the way in which that specular highlight will fall off. And so this represents a brightness and this represents a size. And so you can see that you can imagine that that little graph represents this highlight. So you can switch among these shading models. For intro, we're going to use primarily Blinn. We can discuss other shading models when you get a little bit more comfortable with everything. And you have a couple other parameters here. Diffuse is the color of the thing. So if I wanted to make, red plastic, let's say, I just switch that to red and have a high glossiness and a high specular level, and I could have red plastic. And now if I wanted to be more along the namesake, I could switch this over to a metal shading model and change some of these other parameters up. So metal shading model, you see how that specular is slightly different. It does different things. Now it can even have a really funny curve there, which would make it kind of more satiny, which incidentally metal is also good for. So if I wanted to have some, I could make this more of a brassy color and change the look of that a little bit. But let's reset that. So if I hit this delete button, it ask me a question here. If it's used in the scene, so do you want to affect it in both the scene and the editor slot, or only in the editor slot? This button will get rid of it in just what it's asking you in either the scene, so get rid of it on that object that it's already assigned to, or just get rid of it in the editor slot. Let's affect it both, and that way I can reset this thing, and it's also resetting it in the scene. Now you see each one of these colors or these values has a little box next to it. If I click that little box, it will come up with a thing called, again, the Material Map Browser, and it'll allow me to pick some kind of map that I'm going to map it to. These are basically either bitmaps or 2D or 3D procedural textures. Procedural textures meaning that they are things like noise or checkers, some kind of image that is generated parametrically or procedurally based on a function. And if I map it to a bitmap, it'll come up with a file requester. And I can map it to something here like, some Rust, let's say. And then when I do that, it comes into this new attributes, and these are attributes of that bitmap. So you see there's the name. I can affect a lot of properties about this bitmap. But let's go back to the main material. I can do that a few different ways. There's a little button here, which goes to the parent, whatever this thing is assigned to. There's also a drop-down box, which will allow you to navigate through your material. There's also a material map navigator. If I click on that, this will show me the hierarchy of where I'm at. So I can click on this and it'll go back to the parent. I'll go to this and it'll go to the map that is mapped to that material type. And I can look at all of these things and get little thumbnails for them as well. But this is the handy way because this shows you the relationship. Because you can have things mapped to things mapped to things and have a fairly dense hierarchy. But these little buttons here, these little blank buttons, and when I have something mapped to it, you can see an M gets drawn in there. These little blank buttons are actually shortcuts to this maps section. So if I open that map section up, you see I can map things. I can map bitmaps or procedural maps to a number of different things. More things than are up here. There's more things that can be mapped. So you come down here, and you can also map something in this way too. You can click on one of these buttons, and it'll come up with the same requester, allowing you to map something to any one of these things. And now I can choose to disable that at any time if I want. I can leave it in there, but then I can disable this map to see, well, if it is doing something that I don't want it to do, anything like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to increase the specular level of this thing to give the rest a little bit of specularity. I can make the specular a color if I want to. So if I wanted to have that specularity get influenced by some colors, if I wanted to give it a little warmish value, Most things don't have a lot of color to their specularity. Some things do, primarily metals do, but you don't usually want to go overboard with color on specularities because a lot of times it can make things look metally that you don't necessarily want to look metally. So we click OK, and then we come down here and I'm going to map another parameter called bump. Bump makes things look bumpy. Pretty simple. So I'm going to click this map button here, and I'm going to click map it to noise and click OK. Now what you'll see is even in the little shader ball, it's actually drawn it so that it is starting to look bumpy. There's a size to noise. There's a whole bunch of parameters to noise, but the noise size is going to affect how large the scale of the noise function is. So the bigger it is, the bigger it is. I don't know how else to say it. The smaller it is, then you get these smaller little bits of noise, more pebbly type of noise. So then if I navigate back up through here, I'll see I have color mapped and I have bump mapped. And with bump, you can raise this value and make it even bumpier. And then 3D Studio's material editor is awesome because if you right-click it, the default behavior actually is that if I drag this thing, I can either copy it to a new material slot and have a copy of it, make changes to it, or tweak it from there and have a new material, or assign it to something like I showed. But if you right-click it, you can change the functionality of what happens when you drag. So if you change it from drag copy to drag rotate, then what it allows you to do is rotate the material ball right in there, the little shader ball, and it really gives you a good sense of what the specular does. So if you're, not really too sure if that's going to work well, like maybe I want to increase the level and decrease the glossiness if I want it to be more of a glossy type of a thing, then as I rotate this little shader ball around, I really get a sense of how that material is going to look on something. I love this, and it really helps you when you're doing your materials work, and I haven't seen too many other applications with this kind of interactive functionality. Now, last thing I want to talk about right now is that the last button here is this button called Show Standard Map in Viewport. And this material is assigned to this sphere, so I can tell that by it's selected and it's got the little triangles. So when I click this, Show Standard Map in Viewport, what that does is in the view, it actually puts the texture on there and draws it on for you. So you get an idea of what this looks like on your actual object. Now, it being a sphere, it doesn't really, it looks a lot like that. In fact, it doesn't even look quite as good because in here it's not really going to render quite as accurate as here with bumps and speculars and everything. It'll kind of try to draw the spec, but the bumps are something that it's not really doing just yet. So if I hit delete and put this on a teapot, and so I hit assign, then you can sort of get a sense of what it looks like on a more complex object, and maybe it's not quite what you thought, or maybe it's perfect, but you get a real idea. And they're pretty high res. They're not quite as high res as the actual images themselves, but this is another area in which 3D Studio excels above most other 3D apps, is its viewport display of textures.